Imagine it's a cold winter's night and you're sat there in the big blind, just trying to get through your shift. Folding 9-3 off, folding 6-3 off, when along comes the big bad button bully who makes it 2.5x to go one day, and you're sat there with the 7 of diamonds, 5 of diamonds, and you're like, okay, I better defend. This is a defend. So you flick in the call and you go to a flop which you pretty much just whiff. Horrible flop. Good for the button's range. Let's say it's the ace of spades, the 9 of hearts, and the 4 of diamonds. What a great board for the button's range. What a bad board for your range. You sheepishly check. Kind of serious expression on your face as if you might just check raise, like, yep, you check. Like being super serious and solemn about it. And the button looks right at you and he's like, bro, c-bet. He bets third pot, and you happen to think that this guy's just betting his whole range. He's range betting on ace 9-4, and that's what the solver does. So what are you going to do about it? You're just going to roll over and fold your 7 high? Are you going to fold your 7 high? Well, yeah, because it's 7 high, right? You're going to wait for a better spot. And you're the big blind. You're meant to be the punch bag. You're meant to just roll over and take it, even though when someone calls you bro, they're always being aggressive. You should never accept it when someone calls you bro, even if it's something innocuous like, oh bro, would you mind putting a bit of ketchup on that hot dog for me? That's aggressive because they said bro. So you shouldn't tolerate that shit. But yeah, you should fold this hand, right? There's not much you can really do about it. Wrong. When you flop a backdoor hand, like 7-5 of diamonds on ace 9-4 with a diamond, you should always raise against a range bet 33% pot strategy, according to Pile Solver, who knows more about poker than you and me, but only just. 7-5 of diamonds is a raise all the time, according to the sim. There is an EV loss associated with not raising this hand. If we go to strategy plus EV, we can see that. It's the 5-10 structure. If you fold, you have an EV of 0 because you put no money in, you've lost no more additional money. If you raise, you have an EV of plus 2.91 chips to go for the big raise here. There's also a silly min raise in the sim, which we're not using. And this is what you should do, right? You should raise. But people miss this raise quite often. Now, maybe you were looking at this thinking, yeah, this is a raise, and you've studied this spot, and maybe you even called me bro out of frustration. You should really try and work on that. But yeah, this is a misunderstood spot. The big blind is meant to be a punch bag to some extent, guys, right? There's no two ways about it. When you're in the big blind, you call pre-flop, and your goal is to do better than minus a big blind, which is the same as doing better than minus 100 BB every 100 times you play the spot, right? And that is quite easy to do, even if you have a miserable and torrid time of things after the flop. And you do. Because here, when your opponent bets 25%, there's this thing called the pot odds norm. It's the amount of fold equity you're meant to have. We talk about it a lot in the Carrot Poker School. And that is 25% for a 1/3 pot size bet, because villain is risking 1 unit into a pot that's going to become 4 and needs to get back a quarter of that pot, therefore, to get their 1 unit back. But the reason you fold more than that, you can see you're folding 35% here, is that your range is just terrible. It can't handle the heat. Your range is meant to just go away quite often here. You're out of position. You didn't defend pre so that you could meet MDF on ace 9-4, right? You're not trying to meet minimum defense frequency here. Let's get that straight. But there's overfolding compared to MDF, and then there's overfolding compared to GTO. And you want to avoid the latter. So what we're going to do here is we're going to break our raising strategy down into a few groups, and I'm going to give you guys some pointers on how to not be the punch bag in the big blind by appreciating that your opponent is betting all of their range and appreciating that you can do stuff about that. So first off, the first kind of hand that I would recommend you learn how to raise is the nuts, the thick value. That's pretty easy though, right? The pot is tiny, the SPR is big, you're out of position. If you call and check the turn, villain can check back, pot can stagnate, you can end up on the river with a tiny, tiny pot winning almost nothing. So it's a mandatory raise with pocket fours, a hand that unblocks continuing range and is massive and huge and craves a giant pot. That's easy, that's the easy part. Ace 9, similar kind of thing, but less EV loss associated with calling due to blockers and less strength. But you get the idea. Below that is the thin value region. So ace 10, ace 9, ace 8, ace 7. These hands are kind of balanced on a knife edge. You do want to raise ace 10, ace 8, ace 7, ace 5 against people who are sticky and passive and just calling a lot but not really bluffing a lot. And if your opponent's a triple barrel monkey, then you just want to go ahead and call and let them blast off if you think they're over bluffing. And if you don't know what's going on, you can always mix. It's not really going to be a big deal as long as you don't fold. The next group of hands I want to draw your attention to is the high EV bluff, and there are not very many combos of this on this board because, well, it's disconnected, it's dry, it's disjointed. There aren't many ways you can have flush draws or straight draws. You can just have a gutter. But when you have a gutter with a back door, because you have something like the 5-3 of hearts, you can see that raising is full frequency again, and you're just meant to be raising a ton with these combos. High EV bluffs are few and far between here, which means you're also going to have to unlock a load of low EV bluffs, hands that are barely break even. They're just a bit better than 0 to raise with, like the 8-7, like the 7-5, right? This is only like a third of a big blind, quarter of a big blind better to go ahead and raise here than it is to fold, but you should do it. And there are some real life reasons for that we talk about in Cash Injection episode 1, you can find on Carrot Corner as well. But to stick to the theory for now, these hands are great because they unblock the bet fold range of your opponent. Remember, when your opponent's range betting the flop, their range is going to be littered with a lot of these kind of low EV, low equity hands that are shown in orange or yellow here, like Queen Jack, King 10, King 8, etc. right? And when you raise, these formulate the bulk of the folding range, and they're very unblocked by these low cards. The low cards are surviving against combos like King Queen, King Jack, King 10. They've got lots of outs if these hands do call, and they get them to fold very often as well. So remember that when your opponent range bets, just because the board is good for them overall, and they do have more combos of the absolute nuts, it's still a very small part of a wide range. And there's a big sea of blue here of hands that are just having to bet fold. So if you are feeling like a bit of psychological reluctance, shall we say, to attack in this spot, when you've got, let's say, the 7-5 of diamonds, just picture your opponent with one of those King-Queen offsuit combos and ask how you would feel if you faced aggression in this spot. The other type of hand you're going to want to learn to raise the flop with is a hybrid. Hybrid is a hand that achieves multiple aims when it raises. Hybrids get called by worse hands. They have decent amount of starting equity and decent equity when called. They are behind when called, but they get called by some worse hands, which drives the equity up, post continuing. Hybrids are also hands that are vulnerable. So although they're made hands, they get a lot of fold equity from hands that are super live against them. And that's more important on the flop than it is on the turn, with more cards to come typically. And hybrids also have this ability to improve. They have this hidden potential to spring to life and just become a monster, become a beast. So when you raise here with a hand like 5-4, you can see this is basically a pure raise as well. The idea is that you get called by worse, you have great improvability and implied odds in a big pot sometimes, and your hand is very vulnerable in making your opponent fold their folding range, which is generally unblocked by this hand and stuff like Jack 10, Queen Jack, Queen 10, King Jack, King Queen, etc, etc. You benefit from that, right? It's very important to raise hybrids against people who play passively, because you just get to deny them equity, especially if they're overfolding the flop to a raise here. Then you want to raise tons of these low EV bluffs, high EV bluffs, medium EV bluffs, hybrids, etc. Some other low EV bluffs, by the way, that we didn't quite get to pointing out there are like 10-8, Jack 8, Jack 9, 10-9, Jack 10 suited, this sort of thing. Very, very frequent raises when they exist in the range here. They're 3-betting pre quite a lot. But yeah, when you actually stop and flesh this range out, and you start looking at all the weird hybrid raises and low EV bluff raises and thin value raises, you can see there's lots of hands that you probably just don't raise routinely because you're stuck in the habit of calling, and your opponent just called you bro, so you're intimidated and full of hatred. Or maybe that's just me. I need to work through some issues. But anyway, that's how it goes. One thing you're going to want to do next is take this to the turn, right? So when you raise and your opponent calls you, there's this thing called a heat map. It's not actually called a heat map because Pile Solver calls it a hotness map. I don't think hotness is a good word. So like if you were in a room that was too hot, I don't think you would say, oh, the hotness in here is too much. Like that's kind of weird, but Pile calls it hotness map. So if you go up here to, well, you go to a turn card, select the turn card first of all, let's just say a terrible one for your flop raising range. The 9 of spades, right? Like a really bad card for your flop raising range, probably. Or the 9 of clubs is probably even worse, right? So let's say the 9 of clubs comes on the turn. And then you go to the top of Pile Solver and you go to Analysis. And then there's a window that's popped up here that you can't see, but it says Runouts EV Comparison Hotness. Again, I take huge issue with this, Pio. Sort yourselves out. And I'm going to share this window with you now and show you what this looks like. So this is kind of geeky, jargony, confusing grid of stuff, right? But bear with me here, let me explain this. So on ace 9-4, when you check raise the flop and you're called, there's what I would call a very large asymmetry in ranges. Your range is going to shift towards bluffs and nuts a little bit more. It's going to move away from mediocre hands. Like, okay, you do still have some 4x, you do build around that concentration of the vulnerable third pair, but you're not going to have 6s, 7s, 8s, hands like that, right? And naturally pre-flop, you're not going to have kings, queens, jacks, 10s. Villain has those. He has a monopoly on those. And moreover, you're not going to raise your really bad ace-x, so you're not really raising ace-6, ace-3, ace-deuce here, because they're just too weak, or even ace-5 at much of a frequency. Therefore, you're going to be the polar guy, and villain is going to be the merged guy or girl. So you're going to be in this spot with massive asymmetry, which means that when the low cards come, the deuce, the 3, the 4, that are completing your gut shot draws and your hybrids, your bottom pair, that kind of thing from the flop, you're going to get a big EV boost, right? Which is why your range is entitled to 150 chips out of a pot of 217 here. That's a lot of EV on the deuce of clubs, for example. You'll also note here that there are some really, really bad cards for your range. So you're not raising the flop much with the king, right? The king is basically the brickiest brick for your range, and it hits the opponent sometimes because a few of their king jack, king queen, king 10 backdoor were supposed to peel the flop, remember? The worst turn of all for your range, however, is the ace, because on the ace turn, your combos of 2-pair and top pair thin value bets get decimated, and your opponent's kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 8s monopoly are empowered. They become stronger hands. The queen, the jack, the 10, they're also kind of bad for you, but to a lesser extent. The 9 is notably bad because it just kills your second pair combos and your set of 9s. It's basically a bricky brick as well. And then the lower the card, the better it's going to be for you here, the more it's going to connect with your flop bluffs, the more nutted stuff you're going to have. Ideally, you want that to bring 2-pair for 4x, and you want it to bring straights for some of your gutter raises and stuff like that. So it follows from this that when you get a low turn on this particular board, you want to be following through on the turn at quite a high frequency, but you also want to use big sizes because you also have a nut advantage, right? So let's take a quick look at a turn strategy now and how this is going to work. Here is the big blind strategy on the node where we raised the flop and got called on the deuce of clubs, which is actually one of the best turns in the deck for your range. You can see now that we have a whole new hierarchy of hands. So we still have thick value. That's been expanded a bit by certain combos like 5-3 entering the fray here, 4 deuce hitting 2-pair, that kind of thing. We have thin value still because we're going for bets with ace 10, ace 8 here at some frequency. The solver's playing a bit of block. I wouldn't say that's necessary. You can probably just check ace 8 here if you don't want to bet big with it, which seems a bit thin. And then we have the usual slew of hybrids. Look at all the 4x now that's continuing to bet. At this point, 4x is actually a 3-way hybrid, not a 2-way hybrid. Now, what the hell is Pete talking about? A 3-way hybrid? Well, bear with me. On the flop, when you raised the 4, you didn't really make many better hands fold at all, right? But you made worse hands call, and you got fold equity from stuff that was live against you. That's what I mean by 2-way hybrid. It's like value and it's protection. But on the turn, when you bet big here, you actually begin to make the underpair combos fold. And that's the third part of the 3-way hybrid. That's how it goes from 2 to 3. Now it's the case that we can still get called by weaker hands at some frequency, although it's not clear really that there are loads of those, but there could be like some pocket 3s, or there could be some 4 with a worse kicker or something like that. If the turn brought a flush draw, then there could be like some flush draw hands that we get called by. Then we have the element of improving, which is part of the value element as well, that we can hit like 2-pair or trip still. And the hybrid on a dry board is going to be great because it's going to be really live, right? The outs of 7-4 here, or 7, yeah, the outs of 7-4 here are pretty pristine, right? Because if you hit 7, that's a 2-pair that's hardly ever going to be dominated. And if you hit a 4, well, the trips out is just really, really pure, right? And then you're going to have your bluffing range, which is generally going to be things like the 7-5, the hand in question that we began with at the start here. And because this deuces EV boosting to your range, it's a really good card for your range in general. You can start doing a lot of hybrid betting, bluffing, and value betting. There will be limits, you know. This isn't such a great spot that you can just bet with your eyes shut. If you raise the flop with something like the Jack-8 of diamonds, it's time to give up. There's generally a rule where if you raise the flop with a kind of dubious low EV bluff that's just mainly comprising its equity from second pair draws and backdoors, then if that whiffs the turn, you generally want to give up on these notes. There are a few exceptions to that where the board is just so good for you, you can do whatever you want, but that's generally just not going to be the case. So these hands have to give up. But when we plan our turn strategy here, we base our frequency around how well our range is doing overall, sort of equity versus equity, and we base our sizing around how good our value bets are. So because our value bets are insanely nutted still on this card, we can use this overbet. This is the B120, and this is a really good sizing to use in these kind of spots. I'm going to show you a hand in just a second that I played earlier where I used a size like this on the turn. I'll explain why I think it's good. Let's look at some other turn cards though, because part of playing a good flop raise game is knowing what to do on the turn. If the turn is a king, you're going to have to get cagey. You're going to have to shut down with a ton of your hands. And guess what? That 7-5 of diamonds that you raised the flop with is now a pure give up on the king of hearts turn. Because the range, your range has dropped in EV, and you now have a hand that is like absolutely terrible. In terms of equity, this is an absolutely abysmal hand. It's a 2.55% equity hand, and the EV is going to be approaching 0 because we just have to check fold with it, right? We're just checking. We're basically realizing no EV. We're not going to have many profitable bluffs later. The hand is just doing terribly. So on the king of hearts, the first thing to note is that you're just going to have to be really reserved. You're going to have to remember that you're at a range disadvantage and you have to do a bunch of giving up here. So what do we think about a spot like this? We have ace-5 of clubs in the big blind. There's going to be an open here from the cutoff, and we make the call this time. Decide to defend by taking a flop. The flop is 5-5-4. And this is a flop that's like the absolute opposite to the one we looked at earlier, the ace-9-4, big blind versus button, because on 5-4-5, the opponent, the pre-flop raiser, is meant to basically check back at a very high frequency if you're not building a donk bet. So they're meant to recognize that this is a board where their Broadway cards are kind of rubbish, you know, the cards they have at a higher frequency than you do, because you'll be 3-betting some of yours. They need to understand that you have a bunch of the low cards at a higher concentration than they do. And there's some element of wanting pot control here for their range, right? They have a lot of hands that are just like mediocre ace high, like ace jack high. They have a lot of hands like king queen, hands that don't really want to play big pots. And, you know, even their overpairs here, there's going to be many runouts on 5-5-4 two-tone where like a pair of kings doesn't want to go for 3 streets. It takes a pretty clean run out for a pair of kings to want to go for 3 streets here. And there are many of those, like a 10 comes, then an 8 comes or something like that. But equally, there are runouts like a 3, there are runouts like another 4, there are runouts like a flush. There are just things that can come that degrade those hands. So I guess the way to see this is that the cutoff's best stuff isn't as good on 5-5-4 as it would be on a board like 8-3 deuce. And it's very degradable as well, like later on in the hand. So they want to play a lot of check here. Therefore, big blind should start donk betting, right? Because they want to preempt the fact that check will happen at really high frequency if they check everything. But in a soft game, this is like GG 100 Russian cash game. In a game like this, we can expect people just to snap bet because they're playing 90 tables and they're trying to climb leaderboards and they're broing everyone. They're like, yo, bro, yo, sup, range bet, yo, sup. And when they do that, you can just raise the hell out of them. I don't want to say it's a shame that we've actually got it here, because clearly it's not. But if we did have a solver here for this spot, right? And I'm not going to show you a sim because I just spent a bunch of time in a solver, but I'll make a prediction if you want to run this yourself. If you could lock a solver to bet its range here, which is what some weak players are doing, right? Some people are playing 5-5-4 that way. Not everyone, but I definitely see a lot of snap c-betting here. If you tell a solver to do that, the big blind is going to raise like an absurd amount of the time. I'm going to guess it raises like 43% of the time or something like that. You can let me know in the comments exactly how often it does. So in this spot, you need to be a tyrant in the big blind. Like, far from being a punch bag, you need to actually be a demon now. You need to, like, attack your opponent relentlessly. But we did flop trips here, so, you know, we're going to raise. In terms of sizing, there's an exploit here that we talk about in True EV, the series on Carrot Corner, only for subscribers. Check out carrotcorner.com after the video. But the idea here is that when you're raising the flop, most people are not going to be attentive to whether you make it 6.2 or 7.8 or whatever, right? And you can just go bigger when you have the 5, and you get a similar defense from your opponent. They're not reactive to that discrepancy, generally. So how is the 10 of clubs for your range here? Like, how would this fit in the EV grid? Is this a brick for your range? Are you, like, completely blanking here? Are you down to value combos of just bolts and flop trips? Or do you hit this a lot? Is this a good card for your range? Like, what do you think? Pause the video, think about it. The answer is that the 10 is pretty bad for your range, right? You do not have many bluffs on 5, 5, 4 that contain a 10, although if villain is getting totally out of line in range betting, you'll have a few more. But for the most part, the 10 is kind of a brick for both players, which is going to improve the strength of kings and queens and jacks and combos like that. Even like 9s and 8s and stuff are relatively happy on this card. And therefore your range is going to recoil slightly. Like, you're not going to be betting this card at a super high frequency, but you are going to be using a really big sizing when you bet, because your value region is, of course, something like 5x. Also, remember the 4 here is not so much of a hybrid, because the kicker for the 4 is not going to be live against an overpair, because an overpair will have kings and 5s, for example, which will beat 4s and 7s if you hit the 7 later. So it's worth pointing that out. When you're value betting then, because you're mainly betting bolts and trips and stuff like that, you can simplify your own game here to just using like a B120. You can bet a bit more than the pot, and then you're kind of playing an exponential game from there, like a geometric game, I guess. I don't know why I said exponential, a geometric game, because if you bet here, then pot becomes about 60, villain has about, I don't know, 80 left, and then it's another sort of B125 left for the turn. So our opponent just folds there, which is fine, that's going to happen. And look at the rabbit hunt. 5 of hearts, we're going to make quads. But there are some situations on the turn, right? So if that card had been the 7 of diamonds, what would have happened there? Would have been that our nut advantage would have been degraded, right? Because our 5x is now losing to flushes. And our bad flushes are still not nutted, because villain probably has a higher concentration of the big flushes. We have them too, but villain probably has more big flushes as flushes go than we do. So we're left with this range that's gained a ton of equity, because all the bluffs, or lots of them, have just connected. But villain has now been uncapped by that texture as well, and if we start bombing, they can begin to actually fold like jacks no diamond really easily on the turn of the 7 of diamonds. The solution is to use a high betting frequency with a range advantage, but a small sizing. So on the 7 of diamonds turn, we'd actually have gone for small bets at a high frequency. On the 10 of clubs, we have the nut advantage, but not the range advantage. We go for big bets at a low frequency. This is how I like to teach poker theory. This is how I like to get people up to speed with what's going on, because when you understand all of that, you have a way easier time navigating, you know, after the flop here. Because we do want to get involved in more of these spots. We do want to be check raising the flop. There is an exploit at low stakes and micro stakes where check raising the flop is devastatingly effective, and you guys should be doing it more. So the bottom line is, don't be a punch bag in the big blind, learn to fight back, but study the theory of how turn spots go as well. Play around in some solvers, compartmentalize your continues. Remember, you have thick value, thin value, hybrids, low EV bluffs, and high EV bluffs. Learn what they are, learn what the hands are that just don't raise regardless of your opponent's strategy, like the really mediocre stuff. And be awake, be alert, you know, don't just like fall asleep and roll over in the big blind, and let the rampaging range bets of 2024 torch all of your big blind win rate. Because yeah, you're not trying to win in the big blind, you're not trying to be, you're not going for glory, but you can limit the bleed. You can stem the losses somewhat by playing aggressively enough after the flop with the right types of hands. Hope this video has been useful. It's carrotcorner.com for a subscription and all of our paid stuff and our courses and all of that. And yeah, we'll do some more poker teaching soon. Remember, if someone says bro to you, probably toxic. Unfriend them. Right. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Carrot Corner, where the winners play. Carrot Man's got the tricks to make your Come on down and learn the game.